Imagine for a moment that you could step through a door and find yourself standing amidst the rolling green hills of the Shire, or upon a windswept plain somewhere in the Riddermark. And then imagine that you remember what was happening in the world around you at that very moment. Somewhere to the southeast, beyond the mountains and rivers, a great red eye was peering forth from a dark tower. The legions of darkness were mustering, and war was coming to Middle-earth. In this scenario, would there be anywhere that you could seek safety? Any place where the war would not reach you? Where you could wait in something approaching safety until the fate of the age had been decided? The answer, it turns out, is far more complicated and far darker than you might expect. And the journey that we will take today in search of that answer will carry us from the scorching deserts of the south to the frozen shores of the north, across wild and magical forests, through ancient realms of men long fallen into ruin, and finally to the quiet valleys where elven voices yet lingered in the air. If there is one rule of thumb that emerges from any survey of Middle-earth during the War of the Ring, it is this: the closer you found yourself to the southeast, the nearer you are to peril, and the further north and west, the better your chances of seeing another day. Having said that, this was not a hard and fast rule, and as we shall discover, there were some quite extraordinary exceptions. Let us begin our journey in Mordor, and work our way outward from the darkness toward whatever light and safety we can find. Mordor itself needs little explaining. If you were foolish enough or unfortunate enough to find yourself within the mountain ranges that constituted the borders of the Black Land, then you would be lucky indeed to last the day. Even in the vast, slave-worked fields of southern Mordor, there was nothing there for men save chains and servitude. And so, let us not dwell upon the Black Land and instead move quickly into the mysterious East. Here we find the vast lands known as Rhûn. The men of this region had fallen under the shadow of first Melkor and then Sauron, and they had been twisted by that servitude into a fierce people who were unyieldingly hostile to the men of the West. The Easterlings who poured out of Rhûn to fight for Sauron during the War of the Ring were not conscripts dragged unwillingly into battle. They were by and large willing servants of the shadow, men who had worshipped darkness as a faith for many generations. But there were few orcs roaming freely in this region during the Third Age, for those wild tribes of orcs that had once ravaged the eastern lands in the Second Age had since been united under Sauron's banner. After the fall of Thangorodrim and during the concealment of Sauron, the orcs, recovering from their helplessness, had set up petty realms of their own and had become accustomed to independence. Nonetheless, Sauron in time managed to unite them all in unreasoning hatred of the elves and of men. So, the orcs were gone, pressed into service elsewhere. But the fields of Rhûn were patrolled by another formidable creature, the kine of Aror. These were a type of wild oxen, hardier and more fierce than any domestic beast. And legend tells that they were descended from the cattle of Orome, the huntsman of the Valar. A small aside worth noting here, and one that connects these far-off eastern plains to the very heart of the story. The great hunting horn of Boromir was fashioned from the horn of one of these very beasts. If you managed to evade the wild kine, you might look to find a dwarven settlement in which to take refuge, for there were indeed eastern dwarves. The trouble was that by the time of the War of the Ring, they were abandoning these eastern territories in considerable numbers, migrating westward in response to the growing shadow. We know this because the hobbits of the Shire noticed a striking increase in the number of dwarves passing along the east-west road, and those travellers spoke in troubled voices of things moving in the darkness of the east. There were rumours of strange things happening in the world outside, and as Gandalf had not at that time appeared or sent any message for several years, Frodo gathered all the news he could. There were, however, dwarves on the road in unusual numbers. The ancient east-west road ran through the Shire to its end at the Grey Havens, and dwarves had always used it on their way to their mines in the Blue Mountains. They were the hobbits' chief source of news from distant parts, if they wanted any. As a rule, dwarves said little, and hobbits asked no more. But now Frodo often met strange dwarves of far countries, seeking refuge in the west. They were troubled, and some spoke in whispers of the enemy and of the land of Mordor. When even dwarves are fleeing, that is a rather bold statement about the safety of a region. And to compound matters, we know that some dwarves had pledged their allegiance to Sauron, for there were in fact dwarven warriors fighting in his armies during the War of the Ring. And so, even if you came upon a dwarven settlement that had not yet been abandoned, you would have no way of knowing whether you had found friends or enemies. The conclusion then is that if you found your way into any inhabited settlement in Rhûn, the likelihood was that you had either found men who worshipped Melkor or dwarves who had pledged service to the Dark Lord, and your prospects in either case were not ideal. Therefore, it is perhaps best to avoid the entire region altogether. Moving south then, we encounter the lands of Harad, and here the news does not improve. The great territories that lay below Mordor were home to the Haradrim, fierce warriors who rode into battle upon the backs of the Mumakil. The Oiliphants of the south do seem to be more than simply a large elephant. They were beings of a different order entirely, creatures of such vastness that the mere sight of one was enough to inflict poor Samwise Gamgee with a sense of stupefied awe. Sam saw a vast shape crash out of the trees and come careering down the slope, big as a house, much bigger than a house, it looked to him. A grey-clad moving hill. Fear and wonder maybe enlarged him in the hobbit's eyes, but the Mumak of Harad was indeed a beast of vast bulk, and the like of him does not walk now in Middle-earth. His kin that still live in the latter days are but memories of his girth and majesty. On he came, straight towards the Watchers, and then swerved aside in the nick of time, passing only a few yards away, rocking the ground beneath their feet. His great legs like trees, enormous sail-like ears spread out, long snout upraised like a huge serpent about to strike, his small red eyes raging. Quite apart from the wildlife, the land itself seemed to conspire against the survival of anyone foolish enough to wander there without a guide. The scorching sun beat down from the skies and was rarely troubled by clouds. And even Gollum, who was among the most experienced and resourceful travellers in all of Middle-earth, viewed the prospect of venturing into those southern wastes with something close to dread. On the right, a road went down to Osgiliath and the bridges of the Anduin. In the middle, the road went on southwards.
On,
said Gollum.
We never went that way, but they say it goes 100 leagues. Until you can see the great water that is never still. There are lots of fishes there, and big birds eat fishes. Nice birds. But we never went there. Alas, no. We never had a chance. And further still, there are more lands, they say, but the yellow face is very hot there. And there are seldom any clouds. And the men are fierce and have dark faces. We do not want to see that land.
And the men who inhabited these southern lands were, like the Easterlings, deeply aligned with Sauron, having been subjugated to the same ancient corruption that had hollowed out the civilizations of the East. To the west of Harad lay the havens of Umbar, the ancient stronghold of the Black Númenóreans. The men of Umbar nursed a hatred for Gondor that had only deepened over the centuries into something almost constitutional, a defining feature of their identity rather than a mere political grievance. If you arrived in Umbar during the War of the Ring, your most optimistic possible outcome was probably to end up as a galley slave aboard one of the Corsairs' ships. This was, it should be noted, not quite as final a fate as it might first appear, given that Aragorn would eventually liberate those very galley slaves after capturing the Corsair fleet at Pelargir. But the journey between enslavement and liberation was unlikely to be a pleasant one, and it is hardly what anyone would choose when looking for somewhere to sit out the war in peace. Now, we must consider, however briefly, the two great realms of men that stood at the heart of the conflict. Gondor needs little elaboration. The great kingdom of the south was, during the War of the Ring, under assault from the most powerful military of the age. To take up residence in Gondor during those days was to place yourself directly in the path of that force, and the situation was, by any honest assessment, one that seemed overwhelmingly likely to end in the absolute and total subjugation of the realm. Anyone who chose to make their home in Gondor during this period was, at best, making a wager against very long odds. Rohan, meanwhile, presented its own specific variety of peril. the Riddermark was sandwiched between three malevolent powers: Mordor and Dol Guldur to the east, and Isengard in the northwest. Therefore, the Riddermark was wide open to attack on two fronts simultaneously. And to compound the predicament considerably, its king was, at the start of the war, being held in a state of mental thraldom by the corrupting influence of Saruman, rendering the one man who ought to have been leading the defence of the realm essentially incapable of doing so. This was not, by any reasonable measure, a comfortable place to be. So neither of the primary realms of men would meet our needs. Moving north from Rohan, one's eye might fall upon Fangorn Forest. And here, the thinking of anyone seeking refuge may briefly brighten, for Fangorn was of course patrolled and protected by the Ents, the ancient shepherds of the trees, and was therefore effectively off-limits to orcs, trolls, and other malevolent beasts. But Gandalf himself, who was not a person given to idle warnings, described the forest as being genuinely perilous in its own right.
Certainly, the forest of Fangorn is perilous, not least to those that are too ready with their axes. And Fangorn himself, he is perilous too, yet he is wise and kindly nonetheless. But now, his long, slow wrath is brimming over, and all the forest is filled with it.
Yet the danger of Fangorn was not simply the theoretical possibility of angering Treebeard or one of his kin. The real threat came from the Huorns, ancient trees who had been awakened. We know from the events of the Shire's Old Forest that awakened trees did not tend to discriminate between friend and foe in their hostilities, as Frodo discovered when the roots of Old Man Willow attempted to drown him without warning or provocation. Sam heard two noises, one loud and the other soft but very clear. One was the splash of something heavy falling into the water. The other was a noise like the snick of a lock, when a door quietly closes fast. He rushed back to the bank. Frodo was in the water, close to the edge, and a great tree root seemed to be over him and holding him down. But he was not struggling. Sam gripped him by the jacket and dragged him from under the root, and then, with difficulty, hauled him onto the bank. Almost at once he woke, and coughed and spluttered. "Do you know, Sam," he said at length, "the beastly tree threw me in. I felt it. The big root just twisted round and tipped me in." The Huorns of Fangorn proved themselves at the Battle of Helm's Deep to be utterly merciless, encircling and destroying the routed remnants of Saruman's forces to the last, whether they be Uruk or Dunlending. After their deadly work was done, as the remaining members of the Fellowship travelled in King Theoden's company after the battle, many Huorns passed them by in the dead of night. They camped beside the bed of the Isen River. It was still, silent, and empty. Some of them slept a little, but late in the night the watchman cried out, and all awoke. The moon was gone, stars were shining above, but over the ground there crept a darkness blacker than the night. On both sides of the river it rolled towards them, going northward.
"Stay where you are,"
said Gandalf.
"Draw no weapons. Wait, and it will pass you by."
A mist gathered about them. Above them, a few stars still glimmered faintly, but on either side there arose walls of impenetrable gloom. They were in a narrow lane, between moving towers of shadow. Voices they heard, whisperings and groanings, and an endless rustling sigh. The earth shook under them. Long it seemed to them that they sat and were afraid. But at last, the darkness and the rumour passed, and vanished between the mountain's arms. All it would take is one malevolent Huorn, or a black Huorn, as Treebeard called the most temperamental of the awakened trees, to take a particular dislike to your presence, and whatever plan you had for waiting out the war beneath the boughs of Fangorn Forest would come to an abrupt and unpleasant conclusion. The Forest of Fangorn, then, was not a suitable refuge, and so, pressing north and to the east, we reach the great region known as the Wilderlands, or Rivanian, and here the picture becomes somewhat more varied and considerably more interesting. Let us consider first the Vales of Anduin, a long and broad valley running along the eastern flanks of the Misty Mountains. In the Third Age, relatively few men dwelt in the region, but those who did remain were by all accounts formidable, for here could be found the Beornings, the descendants of the great skin changer Beorn, whom Bilbo and Thorin's company had encountered on their journey to Erebor. Glóin had much to tell of events in the northern regions of Wilderland. Frodo learned that Grim Beorn the Old, son of Beorn, was now the lord of many sturdy men, and to their land between the mountains and Mirkwood, neither orc nor wolf dared to go.
"Indeed," said Glóin, "if it were not for the Beornings, the passage from Dale to Rivendell would long ago have become impossible. They are valiant men, and keep open the High Pass and the ford of Carrick, but their tolls are high," he added with a shake of his head. "And like Beorn of old, they are not over fond of dwarves. Still, they are trusty, and that is much in these days."
But the territory of the Beornings faced 3 distinctly serious threats, each of which was more than enough on its own to constitute a genuine hazard, and together they formed a combination of dangers that would give pause to even the boldest of souls. The Misty Mountains were, at this time, infested with orcs and wolves. Dol Guldur, the fortress upon the southern spur of Mirkwood, housed great numbers of Sauron's servants and was close enough to cast its shadow directly over the region. And on top of all this, the servants of both Sauron and Saruman were at this time desperately scouring the length of Anduin for any trace of the One Ring, since both had determined that it was somewhere in this region that the ring had betrayed Isildur to his death. The Vales of Anduin were therefore, during the War of the Ring, the most intensively monitored stretch of wilderness in Middle-earth, and so to believe that you could settle there peacefully would have been very optimistic indeed. Then, to the east of Anduin, lay the sprawling canopy of Mirkwood, which needs very little introduction to those of you who are familiar with the account of Bilbo Baggins and his unexpected journey. The great forest that had once borne the fairer name of Greenwood the Great had been darkening steadily since the year 1050 of the Third Age, when something foul first crept into its southern reaches and began to corrupt the forest from within. By the time of the War of the Ring, it was a place of genuine horror, for the woods were infested with giant spiders, and the elves of Thranduil's realm, who occupied the northern portion of the forest, were deeply suspicious of outsiders, and they were not known for their hospitality to strangers, as Thorin's company discovered to their dismay. And then there was the darkness. The nights were the worst. It then became pitch dark. Not what you call pitch dark, but really pitch. So black that you really could see nothing. Bilbo tried flapping his hand in front of his nose, but he could not see it at all. Well, perhaps it is not true to say that they could see nothing. They could see eyes. They slept all closely huddled together, and took it in turns to watch. And when it was Bilbo's turn, he would see gleams in the darkness round them, and sometimes pairs of yellow or red or green eyes would stare at him from a little distance, and then slowly fade and disappear, and slowly shine out again in another place. And sometimes they would gleam down from the branches just above him, and that was most terrifying. Mirkwood was, of course, best avoided altogether. However, Dale and Erebor presented a markedly different prospect, and it is here that one's hopes might legitimately begin to rise. These two settlements, the town of men and the great underground kingdom of the dwarves, had both grown considerably in power and prosperity in the decades since the events of The Hobbit. King Dain Ironfoot ruled beneath the Lonely Mountain, and King Brand, grandson of the legendary bard the Bowman, held court in the town of Dale. In fact, by the time of the War of the Ring, Brand's realm stretched far to the south and east of Esgaroth, and relations between the men of Dale and the dwarves of Erebor were as warm and productive as any alliance between the two races had ever been.
"Nowhere are there any men so friendly to us as the men of Dale. They are good folk, the Bardings. The grandson of Bard the Bowman rules them. Brand, son of Bane, son of Bard. He's a strong king, and his realm now reaches far south and east of Esgaroth."
Their strength was considerable, their defences formidable, and their geographical position far to the north of Mordor seemed, on the surface, to offer a genuine prospect of safety. But Sauron was not an enemy who left his flanks unconsidered. He had, with characteristic thoughtfulness, accounted for these two northern realms in his war planning, and had prepared a vast host of Easterlings specifically for the purpose of assaulting Dale and Erebor at the very same moment that his main armies assaulted Minas Tirith, ensuring that they could send no aid south. At the same time as the great armies besieged Minas Tirith, a host of the allies of Sauron that had long threatened the borders of King Brand crossed the River Carnan, and Brand was driven back to Dale. There he had the aid of the dwarves of Erebor, and there was a great battle at the mountain's feet. It lasted 3 days, but in the end, both King Brand and King Dain Ironfoot were slain, and the Easterlings had the victory, but they could not take the gate, and many, both dwarves and men, took refuge in Erebor, and there withstood a siege. The best case scenario for anyone seeking safety in Dale or Erebor during the War of the Ring was therefore to find themselves trapped beneath a mountain, surrounded by Easterlings, hoping that events in the far south would break in the right direction before the food ran out. This was not then, by any reasonable definition, a place of safety. Only one final option remains to us in the wild lands, which is to join with the Northmen of the East Bight. These men had created the great indentation in the western eaves of Mirkwood, which they carved out by the felling of trees over many a year. The people here were a population of men living in small villages and farmsteads. These were essentially ordinary people, peasants and farmers, rather than soldiers, with no permanent fortifications to speak of and no particular military tradition to draw upon. They were therefore extraordinarily vulnerable to raids from the orcs of Dol Guldur to the west and from evil men out of the east. And although these men were left largely untroubled by the events of the war, there was no way to know this at the time, and it would therefore not have been a sensible prospect for someone seeking to flee the war. Thus we have surveyed the lands of the east and the south, and the verdict, by and large, is rather grim. There is only one major exception here, which we will return to when we cover the Elven realms, for the land of Lorien stands apart from everything else we have discussed thus far, and demands its own consideration. Let us first make our way through the Gap of Rohan to continue exploring the world of men, and direct our attention to the western lands, for it is there that some genuinely interesting possibilities begin to emerge. Passing west, we encounter a region that is often overlooked because it has fallen so thoroughly into obscurity: Enedwaith. Once, in the days of Gondor's glory, this had been a territory of the Great Realm, but after the Great Plague had decimated the population and left vast tracts of country depopulated and untended, Enedwaith had reverted to a wild land of fenland and moors and treacherous ground. However, a fairly numerous population of primitive men did continue to live in the region, particularly in the marshlands near to the mouths of the Gwaithlo. Fishers and fowlers they were, a people akin to the Druidine of Anorion, the mysterious forest dwellers who guided Theoden's riders via their secret path to Minas Tirith. There sat Theoden and Eomer, and before them on the ground sat a strange squat shape of a man, gnarled as an old stone, and the hairs of his scanty beard straggled on his lumpy chin like dry moss. He was short-legged and fat-armed, thick and stumpy, and clad only with grass about his waist. If the primitive men of the Enedwaith marshlands were anything like their cousins of the Druidan forest, they would have been secretive to the point of hostility. The chances of such people welcoming a stranger into their community with warmth and openness were at best remote. And so we move on once again to the east of Enedwaith, where we find Dunland. There lived the Dunlendings, who were of course of the regular variety of men, but they had made their alliance with Saruman and were at war with Rohan, which of course made Dunland the opposite of a safe harbour from the war. And so we move on, further north, into the vast region known as Eriador. And here, the picture at last begins to change in genuinely meaningful ways. Most of this region was once known as Arnor, the great northern kingdom of the Dunedain, sister realm to Gondor, and in the days of its founding, the grander of the two realms. But Arnor had divided into 3 successor kingdoms, and those kingdoms had each met their end in their own particular fashion, leaving behind a landscape dotted with the ruins of what had once been one of the mightiest civilizations in Middle-earth's long history. The southernmost of those 3 successor kingdoms had been Cardolan. Cardolan was once populous and powerful. However, it had been diminished by war and pestilence. Then, during the Angmar War, the Witch King sent malevolent spirits to reanimate the bodies of those who were entombed at the Barrow Downs. It was at this time, after the Great Plague, that an end came to the Dunedain of Cardolan, and evil spirits out of Angmar and Rudal entered into the deserted mounds and dwelt there. The land was haunted, even at the time of the War of the Ring, as Frodo and his companions found out, as they stumbled into the grip of these ancient horrors. And only the timely intervention of Tom Bombadil spared them. Cardolan was abandoned and defiled. People left it well alone, and so should we. The easternmost of the three successor kingdoms, Rhudaur, fared little better. Aragorn led the four hobbits through this wild country on their flight to Rivendell, and his words on the matter were unambiguous. No one lives in this land. Men once dwelt here, ages ago, but none remain now. They became an evil people, as legends tell, for they fell under the shadow of Angmar, but that is now so long ago that the hills have forgotten them, though a shadow still lies on the land. Nothing remained in Rhudaur but ruins and evil memories, and neither of those things would keep you warm or fed when the days grew short. In the third and final successor kingdom, Arthedain, we at last encounter some hope for safety. Arthedain had been the most resilient and the most enduring of the three successor states of Arnor, and while it too had ultimately fallen to the power of the Witch King of Angmar, it had done so less catastrophically than its siblings. And in Arthedain, at the crossing of the ancient roads, there had blossomed a community, unlike anything else in the whole of Middle-earth. Bree was the chief village of Breeland, a small inhabited region, like an island in the empty lands round about. Besides Bree itself, there was Staddle on the other side of the hill, Coombe in a deep valley a little further eastward, and Archet on the edge of the Chetwood. Lying round Bree Hill and the villages was a small country of fields and tamed woodland only a few miles broad. Bree was, by the standards of Gondor and Rohan, a very modest place. But what made Bree remarkable was the simple fact that men and hobbits lived there side by side, in a relationship of neighbourly familiarity, and had been doing so for so long that neither party found anything particularly noteworthy about the arrangement. The men of Bree were stout and cheerful, and accustomed to meeting all manner of folk passing through their villages. And Breeland was, for much of the War of the Ring, safe. The reason for this was not obvious to those who lived there, for what protected Bree and the surrounding country was of course the Rangers of the North, Aragorn's people, the last surviving remnant of the Dunedain of Arnor, lonely men who wandered the wild lands, driving back the dark things that crept down from the hills, and doing so in such complete secrecy that the very people they were protecting had come to regard them with a mixture of suspicion and even mild contempt. If Gondor, Boromir, has been a stalwart tower, we have played another part. Many evil things there are that your strong walls and bright swords do not stay, but when dark things come from the houseless hills or creep from sunless woods, they fly from us. What roads would any dare to tread? What safety would there be in quiet lands or in the homes of simple men at night if the Dunedain were asleep or were all gone to the grave? And yet less thanks have we than you. Travellers scowl at us, and countrymen give us scornful names. Strider I am to one fat man who lives within a day's march of foes that would freeze his heart, or lay his little town in ruin if he were not guarded ceaselessly. One might wonder whether it would be possible to seek out the Rangers themselves and find a place among them, but it would seem as though the remaining Dunedain did not maintain permanent settlements or villages. Instead, they spent most of their long lives living as nomads, ranging across vast distances without fixed abode, their chieftain moving between scattered kinsmen rather than presiding over any established seat of power. In those days, no other men had settled dwellings so far west, or within 100 leagues of the Shire. But in the wildlands beyond Bree, there were mysterious wanderers. The Bree folk called them Rangers and knew nothing of their origin. They were taller and darker than the men of Bree, and were believed to have strange powers of sight and hearing, and to understand the languages of beasts and birds. They roamed at will southwards and eastwards, even as far as the Misty Mountains, but they were now few and rarely seen. The final region of note within Arthedain was of course the Shire. The Shire was, in the years before the War of the Ring began, arguably the most peaceful place in all of Middle-earth, and the hobbits who dwelt there were largely and deliberately ignorant of the wider world's troubles. But the War of the Ring did not leave the Shire untouched. Indeed, it found the Shire in a particularly cruel way, for Saruman had long ago taken note of Gandalf's curious interest in the halflings and their land, and when the Dunedain Rangers departed and travelled southward to support their chieftain Aragorn, Saruman dispatched his orc men northward to occupy the Shire and bend it to his will, transforming it into a place of fear and petty tyranny.
"It's these men, Sam, the chief's men. He sends them round everywhere, and if any of us small folk stand up for our rights, they drag him off to the lockholes. They took old Flower Dumpling, old Will Whitfoot the mayor first, and they've taken a lot more. Lately it's getting worse. Often they beat him now."
Even the Shire, then, was not safe during the War of the Ring, and the shadow that fell upon it also touched Bree, for when Frodo and his companions returned after their long quest, they discovered that things had deteriorated markedly in their absence.
"No one comes nigh Bree now from outside," he said, "and the inside folks, they stay at home mostly and keep their doors barred. It all comes of those newcomers and gangrels that began coming up the Greenway last year, as you may remember, but more came later. Some were just poor bodies running away from trouble, but most were bad men, full of thievery and mischief. And there was trouble right here in Bree, bad trouble. Why, we had a real set to, and there were some folk killed dead, if you'll believe me."
Barliman Butterbur describes people fleeing and tells Frodo that there had even been fighting in Bree itself, and thus we discover that the war in the south had found even the small villages of the north. What this passage also confirms, though, is that other desperate travellers had already thought of the exact same strategy that we're discussing, and had made for the north. And the fact that Bree had survived these troubles with only a handful of casualties does still speak to its relative level of safety compared with the catastrophes unfolding in the south. But Barliman goes on and speaks of other dangers.
"You see, we're not used to such troubles, and the Rangers have all gone away, folk tell me. I don't think we've rightly understood till now what they did for us, for there's been worse than robbers about. Wolves were howling round the fences last winter, and there's dark shapes in the woods, dreadful things, that it makes the blood run cold to think of. It's been very disturbing, if you understand me." "I expect it has," said Gandalf. "Nearly all lands have been disturbed these days. Very disturbed."
So, although Bree did indeed feel the absence of the Rangers, they were comparatively unaffected by the events of the war. But was there somewhere where men were safer still? There is one more group of men in Middle-earth to consider, those who lived at the very furthest extreme of the known world. For there were men who lived upon the frozen shores of the ice bay of Forahel, and they were known as the Lossoth. They knew the ice and the ways of the terrible cold, and they had in the past provided shelter to a figure of tremendous importance, Arvedwy, the last king of the Dunedain of Arthedain, who after his catastrophic defeat at the hands of the Witch King had fled northward and eventually sought the help of the Lossoth. For a while, Arvedwy hid in the tunnels of the old dwarf mines near the far end of the mountains, but he was driven at last by hunger to seek the help of the Lossoth, the snowmen of Forahel. Some of these he found in camp by the seashore, but they did not help the king willingly, for he had nothing to offer them, save a few jewels which they did not value, and they were afraid of the Witch King, who, they said, could make frost or thaw at his will. But partly out of pity for the gaunt king and his men, and partly out of fear of their weapons, they gave them a little food and built for them snow huts. The Lossoth, then, were not so hospitable as the men of Bree. Their assistance to Arvedwy was reluctant and born as much of wariness as of genuine charity, and the practical challenge of even reaching them, navigating the frozen wastes of the far north in search of a nomadic people who left no roads, was a genuine gamble with one's survival. Therefore, just as it was for Arvedwy, Forahel for us should be a last resort. Now we can finally turn at last to the Elven realms. First, let us consider Lothlorien, which we skipped over back in Rivanion. Here dwelt the Lady Galadriel, who bore Nenya, the Ring of Water, and the power of that ring invested the entire realm with a quality of preservation that the forces of darkness found extraordinarily difficult to penetrate. But Lothlorien was not invulnerable, and two great threats lay close to its borders. Firstly, the open east gate of Moria lay close by, leading into the depths of the mountain halls, where the Balrog of Morgoth yet prowled in the dark, and where many orcs dwelt. The sense of fear that this terrible foe provoked was real and palpable. In fact, many elves departed from Lorien after the Balrog was disturbed from its long slumber. But even more pressing than this were the orcs of the great fortress of Dol Guldur, which lay close at hand in Mirkwood, directly across the river from the Golden Wood's eastern borders. And during the final days of the War of the Ring, the orcs it housed sallied forth and attacked Lothlorien. 3 times Lorien had been assailed from Dol Guldur, but besides the valour of the elven people of that land, the power that dwelt there was too great for any to overcome, unless Sauron had come there himself. Though grievous harm was done to the fair woods on the borders, the assaults were driven back. The power of Nenya and the skill of the defenders was, in the end, sufficient to repel these assaults. Though the fighting was real and fierce, and the borders of the Golden Wood bore the scars of battle. Similarly, the woodland realm of Thranduil, in the northern reaches of Mirkwood, came under direct assault at the same time. In the north also there had been war and evil. The realm of Thranduil was invaded, and there was long battle under the trees and great ruin of fire. But in the end, Thranduil had the victory. Therefore, neither of the elven realms of Rhovanion could be said to have been safe during the darkest days of the war, which brings us at last to the final 2 western settlements of the elves, and these present us with perhaps the most appealing options for safety. The first and easternmost of the 2 is Rivendell, Imladris in the elven tongue, the last homely house east of the sea that Elrond had founded in the Second Age as a refuge during the terrible wars of that era, and had maintained thereafter as a beacon of wisdom and healing and counsel. Here the Lord Elrond possessed Velia, the Ring of Air, mightiest of the 3 elven rings, and therefore a power even greater than that which had shielded Lorien was found in Rivendell. And Imladris was, of course, very cleverly concealed, making it incredibly safe. However, Rivendell was not easily reached. The lands which surrounded it, such as Trollshores and Coldfells, were infested with trolls, as Frodo and the dwarves discovered when they met 3 trolls named William, Tom and Bert on their way to Erebor. Although the dwarves of Thorin's company managed to escape from their captors with the help of Bilbo and Gandalf, Aragorn's grandfather, Arador, was not so fortunate. And it happened that when Arathorn and Gilrain had been married only 1 year, Arador was taken by hill trolls in the Coldfells north of Rivendell and was slain, and Arathorn became chieftain of the Dunedain. The approach from the east was also perilous, for the mountain passes above contained secret entrances to Goblin Town, as Bilbo and the dwarves had so memorably discovered. So, as we can see, getting to Rivendell required navigating a gauntlet of dangers on every side. But if you could make the journey, if you could survive the Trollshores or the mountain passes, then what awaited you was genuine safety. The second of the western settlements of the elves was of course the Grey Havens, which were found in the broad coastal lands known as Lindon, which stretched along the western shore of Eriador. Círdan the Shipwright ruled there as Lord of the Grey Havens, the port from which the white ships had sailed into the west. Lindon was remote from any enemy stronghold, shielded by distance and by the wide buffer of Eriador between it and the nearest hostile force. Although the elves of Lindon had played a significant role in the Angmar War many centuries before, they saw no direct military action during the War of the Ring, and the shores of Lindon remained peaceful, whilst the rest of the world felt the shadow of war pressing upon it. Between Lindon and Rivendell, then, we have the 2 strongest candidates for genuine safety. One near the Western Sea, quiet and distant from the conflict, the other hidden in a valley and protected by the mightiest of the elven rings. But here we must confront the question that has been hovering over the entire last section of our analysis. For although elves and men had always maintained cordial relations of varying degrees, living amongst elves was a different matter entirely. In Middle-earth, even those partnerships, where 2 different races had worked most closely together, such as the extraordinary collaboration between the dwarves of Khazad-dûm and the elves of Eregion in the Second Age, or the long and productive alliance between the dwarves of Erebor and the men of Dale in the Third. The two races had always maintained their own distinct communities, and had shared work and trade without sharing a home. Therefore, it seems unlikely that men would find long-term habitation amongst the elves. And so, weighing everything that we have discussed, from the burning deserts of Harad to the frozen shores of Forahel, where does our final judgment come to rest? If we are seeking the most powerful magical protection available, then Rivendell stands above all others, shielded as it was by Velia. But Lindon too was safe, perhaps the most quiet and unassumingly safe of all the Western lands. But if we are seeking somewhere that a mortal man might actually be received with warmth, accepted into a community of ordinary folk, then there is only one real answer: Breeland. Although the times were hard and the Rangers had departed, it was still relatively safe as long as you kept your wits about you and didn't go abroad alone after dark. There you could either stay in Bree itself and drink at the Prancing Pony with the locals, or you could choose to join the hobbits of Staddle on the far side of the hill and perhaps sample some of the pipeweed which grew on the south slopes of Bree Hill. Or you could follow the smoke which issued from the hearths of Coombe down in its deep valley. Or maybe even stray off to the woodland village of Archet, which lay upon the edge of the Chetwood. It was not glamorous, it was not magical. It was merely a community of decent people trying to live their lives as well as they could, whilst the world outside went through its upheavals. And at least for me, this is where the truest sense of safety would be found. Not in the most powerful city, or in the most magical realm, but in the most humble of human places, amongst the most ordinary of folk. Thank you very much for tuning into Realms Unravelled. I would like to take this opportunity to light the beacons and call for aid. If you did enjoy this video, I would ask that you kindly click the like button below. Also, I would be very grateful if you would consider subscribing and clicking on the bell icon. And until next time, farewell, fellow explorers of Middle-earth.